Self-realization is that which is most important in life. Realization of the self alone, solid, enduring happiness. Knowledge of the self alone is the seeing of reality. How can we compare anything of the unreal with the real? If we acquire something unreal, it is like something acquired in a dream. If we experience something unreal, it is the same as if it were experienced in a dream. How could such ever compare to the knowledge of reality, which is abidance as the self? One who abides as the self remains supremely detached with the innate detachment of the self. That is, the reality does not touch the unreal, for the unreal simply is not, and the real is the perfect fullness or bliss. In the next text, within the bouquet that we're going to pick up, the first term employed in the title of the text is Anatmasri. Anatma means the non-self. Anything but the self is Anatma. Shri, as has been noted at the beginning of the text, and a kind of note on translation, means wealth, beauty, success, power, rank, achievements, etc. In other words, it refers to any kind of acquisition. In this text, Adi Sankara lays a special emphasis upon complete detachment. If we are attached to the unreal in any manner, in any form, how will we realize the reality? Since the reality is the self of the nature of being, consciousness, bliss, Shankara has said Anatmasri, the acquisition of what is not the self. As for the self itself, it is the supreme attainment, and yet it is not an acquisition. Anything else is an acquisition that comes and goes, but being anatma, not self, is actually unreal and not true bliss, not true knowledge. Vigarhana means deprecation. So the text is a criticism of the acquisition of what is not the self. What is criticized is not so much particular actions, and certainly not the actions of others. That's usually not advisable for spiritual seekers. What's being criticized is the mentality, the attitude that seeks to secure happiness, peace, greatness, and such outside or in a place other than the real self. What is criticized, therefore, is the pursuit of illusion, which can never supply what the reality of the self alone is. The verses are very easy. They're easy in Sanskrit, they're even easier in English. The verses are easy. One can read the whole text, it's only 18 verses, within a very short time. But as with any text on knowledge, the thing to do is to go deep with it and apply it to your actual experience. If you can apply the message of this in your actual experience, if you can apply what he is giving instruction in, you'll be very free and detached from anything in this whole world. Not only anything in this world, but anything of any other world as well. Some of what he offers a deprecation of at first may seem remote from you. Some of it may seem applicable, some of it not so readily applicable. However, a little reflection will make the entirety of it applicable. If you look to the principles being pointed out, and not as much to the particular example cited.
Can you just explain just a little bit more? I actually don't heard. Is there an example?
Well, of the last point I was making?
Yeah.
In the text, he will decry the pursuit of certain worldly objects. You may or may not have an interest in those objects, but it's the seeking in the worldly manner that's being decried. Similarly, he will criticize various attainments that may be, in some circles, considered spiritual, miraculous powers, etc. But what principle should be understood? It should be understood that the acquisition of any spiritual state, any mystical state, any subtle state, etc., and any advantage apparently that one gains in that is not worth anything if there's not self-realization. Verse 1.
Labdha vidya rajamanya tata kim prapta sampat prabhavadya tata kim bhukta nari sundarangi tata kim Yena swatmanaiva sakshat krito bhut.
Learning worthy of honor by a king has been attained. So what? A fortune of great opulence has been obtained. So what? A lady of beautiful limbs has been enjoyed. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. The last line will be the constant refrain throughout most of the verses. By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. Only the perception of the self is bliss. Only the perception of the self is the seeing of reality. Anything other than that is, in the final analysis, living and dying in an unreal dream, and not our natural state. He begins by giving 3 examples. Learning, that is to say, intellectual attainments, intellectual prowess, intellectual abilities. A fortune of great opulence, that is any kind of worldly or material acquisition. And then a lady of beautiful limbs. If you're a lady, you may want to replace it with a man of such and such a description. And all that goes with that. The idea of enjoyment through sexual and other means, companionship and such. So these are the first 3 things he comments upon. If we learn about ever so many things, but we don't know the self, what do we actually know? Whatever be the kind of learning. Again, if one develops great intellectual abilities, the ability to think furiously, what has actually been gained? If you don't know yourself, what is the use of being able to think furiously, intricately, very complexly about any number of topics? If we acquire learning about ever so many things, but we don't know what our own nature is, what have we actually obtained? His response, that of Shankara, so what? Of what use is it? Of what value is it? The implication is that the one thing to be known is one's own true nature. And that being known, all that need be known is known. A fortune of great opulence has been obtained. So what? If you gain any kind of material thing, and here he is stressed it into excess, great fortune, tremendous opulence, but you don't know yourself, so the actual storehouse of happiness is not open to you. So what? And a person who has pursued such material acquisition while neglecting to know himself is in the similar boat as the one who pursues intellectual knowledge but fails to have the subjective knowledge of himself. Shankara says, so what? Of what use is it? Of what purpose? Just seeing this much can make you detached from all material things. Just as in the first line, just seeing that much can make you detached from the mind. The third line was, a lady of beautiful limbs has been enjoyed. So what? If passions are entertained and one gains various pleasures, what does it mean? If you don't know yourself, the source of infinite bliss, the one without a second, of what avail has it all been? Of what use? If you attain any of these things but do not know yourself, have you really got what needs to be attained? But if you do directly perceive your own nature and know yourself so thoroughly that you abide identified with the self, always, steadily, without any variation, then your peace, your happiness and such are full. And then from there, what do these other things mean? From the position of directly perceiving the self, hearing about these other things, Shankara says, so what? The unreal holds no significance for the real. And for those who seek to realize the highest truth, they should embrace this kind of detachment, so they see always what is significant and what is utterly insignificant.
Actually, the description, beautiful limbs, I mean, really, there's, the mind might think, okay, there's something valuable there, but when you just break it down just to parts, it's just all in the mind in a certain sense. I mean, the attachment or the acquisition, or his attachment to that acquisition, just all in the mind. Really,
It's acquisition of something inert, unreal, just an assemblage of miscellaneous parts. In these verses, in very brief form, he tries to be a bit descriptive. As you listen and contemplate upon them, you can fill in easily the rest of the image for each of these and all that follows. It's easy to fill in the image. But no matter how the mind is entertained by the image, of what use is it?
Yeah, it is interesting that no matter what these three states, it really doesn't change you. I mean, it's kind of, they're all just kind of like the magic show in front of you appearing. It doesn't really change. It just seems like it just has no ability in a certain sense.
And that's why Shankara has in these verses, that we just looked at the first verse, given emphasis to a transcendent indifference. So what? He's not concerned with whether these things are to be considered good or bad. He is indifferent. So what? It is meaningless. Whether we think these things are admirable or otherwise, it's utterly insignificant. If we think these things are desirable, we're just sorely mistaken, because they're inert, they're unreal.
Yeah, that's sort of what struck me, is that there's no substance, I guess. In the illusion, it seems like, okay, there's some benefit, there's some positive thing, right?
Oh, each of these things you can imagine within samsara, some benefit. There'll be some pleasure, some ease, some honor, some reward somehow. But outside that bubble of illusion, what does it amount to? An illusory reward for an illusory attainment of an illusory thing. None of which has anything to do with the self or the reality.
Yeah, actually it's a great description, because it's all bubble upon another bubble, and it's just, there's nothing there.
It's just a bubble, empty bubble. Verse 2.
केयूराध्यैर्भूषितो वा ततः किं कौशेयाध्यैरावृतो वा ततः किं तृप्तो मृष्टानादिना वा ततः किं येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत्.
Or by armlets and such one has been decorated. So what? Or one has been covered with silken garments and such. So what? Or one has been satisfied by tasty food and such. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. The first two lines deal with one's appearance, that is the bodily appearance. For matters concerning bodily appearance, and all the thoughts and ideas, worldly rewards one might associate with that outer appearance, Shankara says, so what? He's given the example of armlets and such. You may not have armlets, you might have something else. Silken garments, you may have a different kind of garment. The particulars are not important. He's just given the hint and saying, so what? The mental attitude that counts one's own appearance as important, as if one's happiness depended upon it. To this he says, so what? And for one who has realized the self, as Shankara has, there is utter indifference to matters of outer appearance. So what? Throughout this entire text, we should see the similarity of the detachment that he's inculcating in the aspirant, and the detachment that the realized, abiding as the self, have. It's the same detachment, in essence. And that detachment is rooted in the reality of the self. And one has been satisfied by tasty food and such. So what? What is said about taste can be applied to all five of the senses. So your senses meet with agreeable sense objects. So what? how much of life could be spent pursuing agreeable sense objects? Many people do so from their infancy onwards, starting usually with food. And if you get what you like, he says, so what? There's no permanence in it. There's no deep bliss in it. There's no freedom in it. There's no real peace in it. There's no reality in it. And if you abide as the self, in the perfect fullness of bliss that is natural to be in, then how could you in your heart care for what the senses perceive, what meets with the senses? All of us know the stories, the various anecdotes told about the Maharshi and his indifference to whatever was given to him, assuming it was in some way edible. He was utterly indifferent. Some of those with him were amazed at his indifference. That transcendence is actually natural. It's glorious, so they should be amazed. It's unlike any samsaric state. But it's also very natural. We who are the self, beyond the senses, should have no dependence on the senses. Satisfaction of the senses can never in any way compare with innate bliss. And one who sees it like this will not be disturbed by the pleasures and pains of the senses. To all of them, he says, so what? And if you approach with the same kind of detachment, that direct perception of the self will be yours. Verse 3.
दृष्टानानाचारुदेशा ततः किम् पुष्टाश्चेष्टा बन्धुवर्गाः ततः किम् नष्टं दारिद्र्यादिदुःखं ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत्.
Various beautiful countries or places have been seen. So what? Groups of relatives, rich and beloved, are there. So what? Poverty, pain, or we can translate it as trouble, and such have disappeared. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. The quest for happiness and seeing different places. Nowadays we could call it tourism. Can't make anyone happy. Bored with one place, one goes looking for another place. What's marvelous is not places. What's marvelous is the direct perception of the self. Now, if you've seen various places, but you haven't seen yourself, Shankara says, so what? What have you actually seen? You have visited places in your dream, that's all. And no matter how marvelous they might appear in a dream, they're still just dream. Nothing more than imagination. So towards that approach, towards that mental attitude, Shankara says, so what? We should take this view toward any place in this world. The place to be, really, is not in this world. The place to be is where the world dissolves. Groups of relatives, rich and beloved, are there. So what? He begins by saying groups of relatives. Then he qualifies it. Rich and beloved. Because most people already know that if you have a group of relatives and they're not beloved, or they're not dear, they can be as much a nuisance as anyone else. So he says, rich and beloved. They're materially taken care of or beneficial to oneself. And they're beloved. They're treating each other in a decent way, apparently caring for each other and such. But he says in relation to all of that, so what? Now, if they weren't beloved and such, it's easy enough to say, so what? But here he is pointing out detachment from the family life entirely. So what? Whether physically associating with them or not is not significant. It's like which country you're in the first line. That's not significant. What is significant to the one who is seeking to know the truth is the detachment or the attachment. If you're detached, abiding as that which has never been born, how can you have relatives? While in a phenomenal sense, your body will have relatives, how can you have relatives? Or from another angle of vision, everyone's your relative, or has been at one time or another, viewed over enough period of time. But from an absolute point of view, one has no family or samsara.
It seems like stories of Ramana in the early days when his mother had discovered where he was and was trying to assert her being a relative is a real good example of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, when the mother came and prior to her, when the uncle arrived and wanted to question him about what he was up to.
That's right. And why didn't you go home to mother?
But he had no such misidentification and no remaining attachment. That same freedom from attachment must be ours in relation to all these things. So consider for yourself. Do you think of yourself as part of a family? And if so, in what way? Do you consider the places you live and visit, etc.? And if so, in what way? Do you consider yourself in relation to material things? And if so, in what way? To all of those things and more, Shankara says, Tata Kim, so what? So what?
So then what's the value of marriage then? I mean, if it's sort of, does it have any value then? Is it just a cause for more attachment?
It depends on the approach taken. The best is to be married to the truth.
So that's the approach taken in...
And you can understand that at any level that you wish. Who are you? Who is the other? Who is the husband? Who is the wife? If we don't know these, we don't know the answer to such questions, we don't have the direct perception of the self, then in relation even to marriage and such, you would say, So what? In the final analysis, what has it all been about?
So then taking the position of remaining married to truth, one can then see that as a value.
If one's married to the truth, one's absorbed in the truth, as indicated in the marital garland of letters. And if you're absorbed in the truth, there remains no separate individual, neither a self nor another. If you want to call that holy matrimony, you can, but it takes on a completely different significance.
The two as one.
Now you have to know what that one is. And that relates to the direct perception of the self. If there's that direct perception of the self, then you have found that which is supremely beneficial. If that's not being inquired into, then we're merely speaking about dream characters in a dream world. Again and again, he indicates we should examine all these things and see them in the light of the self. Because without the knowledge of that light of the self, all these other things amount to, well, so what? Verse 4.
स्नातस्तीर्थे जनुजादौ ततः किम् दानं दत्तं द्व्यष्टसंख्यं ततः किम् जप्ता मन्त्रा कोटिशो वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत्.
Ganga and other holy rivers have been bathed in. So what? 16 categories of gifts have been given. So what? Or mantras in crores have been chanted. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. The first 3 verses dealt primarily with worldly acquisition. And in the 4th verse, he starts to comment upon spiritual acquisition, so-called, here dealing with things that are considered meritorious. He'll deal with other aspects of spirituality later in the text. Here he deals with things that are considered meritorious, things that give merit, provide virtue, give benefit, or are considered to take away one's defilements or sins, etc. Bathing in holy waters, giving gifts, such as giving gifts to Brahmins, etc., according to tradition. Or mantras in crores. Crores means 10 million. Millions of mantras repeating all this. Millions of prayers. He says, all this has been done. But if you don't know your own self, what have you actually been doing? Unless you directly perceive your own self, what does all that merit amount to? Again, it's not so much a condemnation of these things, but a critique of the mental attitude that seeks to find what we really want outside of the self. It will not be found in objects, it will not be found in family, it will not be found in other things, it will not be found in wealth. And similarly, it won't be found in a river, however holy the river is. It won't be found in the merit from all these mantras, etc. It won't be found in the merit gained by giving gifts to the holy people, etc. Where is it to be found? We should perceive it where it is. For one who perceives it where it is, then all these things neither add nor subtract from oneself. So toward them, Shankara says, so what? Nothing of the unreal, gross or subtle, amounts to much in the light of reality. Verse 5.
Gotram samyak bhushitam vatata kim Gatram bhasmachaditam vatata kim Rudrakshadi sadhrito vatata kim Yena swatmanaiva sakshat krito bhut.
Or the lineage has been well adorned, so what? Or the body has been covered by holy ashes, so what? Or one has been well decked with Rudraksha and such, so what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. The preceding verse dealt with more of the religious practices one might expect to find among householders and others, though. Here he has dealt with those devotees who are going to take a more renounced kind of lifestyle. Draksha beads, holy ashes, etc., according to tradition. But unless you realize yourself, unless you see your own nature, what do those Rudrakshas amount to? Unless you've seen that within yourself, where the last vestige of ignorance has been utterly burnt up so that only the residuum remains, what good is a handful of ashes? A whole body covered by ashes. And if we know the self and abide as that, then all these things do not matter one way or the other. So toward them all, Shankara says, so what? Verse 6.
Annairviprastarpita vatata kim Yajnaiddevastoshita vatata kim Kirtya vyapta sarvalokah tata kim Yena swatmanaiva sakshat krito bhut.
Or Brahmins have been given satisfaction by food, so what? Or the gods have been made happy by ritual sacrifices, so what? All the worlds have been pervaded by one's fame, so what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. In all three of the lines, the examples are ones in which one gains some kind of acceptance or approval for having done some kind of deed. Approval by men or by gods, as he says. All the worlds have been pervaded by one's fame. In other words, one has got the approval of everybody in this world and the next and whatever. They're all accepting of you. Gods, Brahmins, everybody's accepting you. So what? Have you pursued some kind of acceptance in some way or another? Tried to make yourself approvable? Without knowing your own self, what does it avail you? Even if you accomplish that and get what is being sought that way, what's being desired, Shankara says, so what? It can never be perfect bliss. It cannot be real happiness. It cannot be the reality. And if we know the reality, if we perceive the self, then even if all these things would happen, and the whole world resounded with your fame, your attitude toward it would be utter indifference. So what? The real is not impressed by the benefits of the unreal. So we see this again in the life of the Maharshi. when there were just a handful of people there or no one there in the early days at Arunachaleshwara temple, till when there were hundreds of people around, or in some of the big occasions, thousands of people around. He was utterly indifferent. A whole crowd and an empty cave were identical. People worshiping him, people ridiculing him, and people indifferent or having nothing, no one way or another in relation to him. He was indifferent to all of that, transcendent of it all, abiding in the bliss of the self. Because when you abide in the bliss of the self, as far as everything else is concerned, so what? Verse 7.
Kaya klishtaschopavasaistatah kim labdha putra sviya patnyastatah kim pranayama sadhito va tatah kim yena swatmanaiva sakshatkrito bhut.
The body has been mortified by fast. So what? Sons of one's own wife have been obtained. So what? Or regulation of prana has been accomplished. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. The lines in this verse all deal with bodily states. The first being ascetic. He says, if you mortify the body through asceticism, so what? What has that got to do with self-realization, the direct perception of the self? The second line says, you get children, get sons by your own wife. Usually in the world it's considered a grand thing. But Shankara says, unless you perceive your own self, so what? It's just more dream characters parading around in a dream world. You have to know the reality. And the third line, regulation of prana has been accomplished with all the implied powers or benefits to the body, etc., by control of prana, the life energy. He says, so what? We can read the third line, interpret it in translation almost slightly cynically, and it could read, or one has been wearied by pranayama. So what? We've put it in here as an alternative. Whether he meant the double entendre, the double meaning, is not clear in the text, but it could mean either one. In any event, if you perceive the self towards all this, the feeling is utter detachment. So what? And if you would realize the self, then towards all these bodily things, your attitude must be, so what? Because your heart's set firmly on the goal of perceiving the self. And then having perceived the self, the one reality, the unreal is of no significance. Verse 8.
Yuddhe shatrur nirjito va tatah kim bhuyo mitrai purito va tatah kim yogai prapta siddhayo va tatah kim yena swatmanaiva sakshatkrito bhut.
Or the enemy has been conquered in war. So what? Or one has been surrounded by still more friends. So what? Or supernormal powers have been obtained by yogas. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. We can read these three lines here as being just individual examples of different kinds of attainment, Or we can see them as related to power or influence. And it's a critique upon that state of mind or vasana, tendency of the mind, that seeks some kind of sphere of power or influence. That is, the enemy has been conquered in war, being physically overpowering toward anyone or everyone else. One has been surrounded by still more friends, so that one's reputation is overpowering, your charisma is overpowering. Or supernormal powers have been obtained by yoga. You've conquered the elements, states of the body, the subtle power, subtle energy. All this has been conquered by yoga. It's extending the sphere of power from an illusory individual. So Shankara says, so what? And if you know yourself, if you have directly perceived the self, then the approach is still, so what? Because what do those things matter? Even if they would occur for you, they amount to nothing. Verse 9.
Abdhi padbhyam langhito va tata kim vayu kumbhe sthapito va tata kim meru Panav uddhrito va tata kim yena swatmanaiva sakshat kruto bhut.
Or the ocean has been traversed by the feet, so what? Walking over the water, the ocean. Or the breath has been established in a hold, in retention, so what? Or the Meru mountain has been lifted in the hands. So what? Meru mountain is a mountain of, mythical mountain of gargantuan proportions. Lifting it up with one's hands indicates the miraculousness of one's power or ability, or one's strength. Likewise the others. So one can do marvelous things that are apparently impossible. Even if you could do this. Some might associate that with spiritual power, spiritual prowess. But Shankara says, so what? What has that got to do with directly realizing the self? And if you have directly realized the self, then the ocean and the feet, the breath and its retention, the hands and the meru amount to just dream stuff. So what? Verse 10.
Shvela pito dugdhavadva tata kim vaknirjagdho lajavadva tata kim praptaschara pakshivatkhe tata kim yena swatmanaiva sakshat krito bhut.
Or poison has been drunk like milk, so what? Implying as harmless as milk. If you're allergic to milk, you kind of miss the analogy. It assumes that you can drink milk. Or fire has been consumed like fried grain, so what? Movement in the sky like a bird has been obtained, so what? You can just fly. By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. Again, even if you could do things that were apparently impossible, or you could engage yourself in death-defying adventures. However exciting that may appear to be to the worldly minded, to the spiritually minded, so what? And if you do know yourself, having directly perceived your own nature, then you will feel indifferent, as indicated by the Maharshi when he said, we'll just see what strange things happen. Implying that he would remain as the witness of all, and that all these happenings in the world, subtle things and etc., were just strange occurrences and are of no consequence. Verse 11.
सम्यक् पावकाध्यास्ततः किं साक्षात् विद्धालोहवर्यास्ततः किं लब्धो निक्षेपोञ्जनाद्यैस्ततः किं येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत्.
Fire and such have been well contained. So what? The best of precious metals have been pierced or split before one's eyes. So what? Disappearance has been attained by magical unguents and others. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. If you could contain physical fire, but didn't know yourself, so you were still burned by delusion, what good would it be? If you could pierce physically or with your mind through the hardest of metals, but you couldn't pierce or penetrate through the core of your own mind, what good would it be? Or if you could make the disappearance of your body possible, you could become the invisible man, but you still hadn't managed to make your ego disappear. So what? He said, Kim, so what? What has this got to do with perceiving the self? And if you do perceive the self, all these things are of no consequence. Verse 12.
भूपेन्द्रत्वं प्राप्तमुर्व्यां ततः किं देवेन्द्रत्वं संभृतं वा ततः किं मुण्डीन्द्रत्वं चोपलब्धं ततः किं येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत्.
Lordship over kings has been obtained in this world. So what? Or lordship over the gods has been possessed. So what? And lordship over the shaven-headed, meaning the sannyasins, has been obtained. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. Similar to an earlier verse, it deals with the sense of power, sphere of influence. Even if all people were beneath you, even if all the sannyasins, he said, those who were renounced of the world, were subordinate to you, so that you held religious prestige and power. Unless you know yourself, so what? And if you do know yourself, then you see all as the self. And such a position in life would be viewed as, so what? Verse 13.
मन्त्रै सर्वस्तम्भितो वा ततः किं बाणैर्लक्ष्यो भेदितो वा ततः किं कालज्ञानं चापि लब्धं ततः किं येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत्.
Or all have been paralyzed by mantras. So what? Or the target has been split by arrows. So what? And knowledge of time has also been obtained. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. The first two lines follow along the same theme as been indicated in the previous several verses. Having marvelous power of some kind or another. Having great abilities to penetrate what's gross and subtle and to exercise power over it. He says, so what, unless you know yourself? Knowledge of time can be understood as being indicative of knowing things of the past, knowing things of the future, or knowing when the auspicious times are for things, which will bring about the most benefit in terms of worldly interactions. He says, even if you know these things, what the right moment, the best moment for something is, Or even if you know all the past, even if you know all the future. We can throw in the present, even if you know the present time. So what? It's just knowledge of illusion. And one who knows himself, who has directly perceived his own nature, views it all with utter indifference. Verse 14.
कामातङ्कः खण्डितो वा ततः किं कोपावेशः कुण्ठितो वा ततः किं लोभाश्लेषो वर्जितो वा ततः किं येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत्.
Or the affliction of craving has been destroyed. So what? Or possession by anger has been blunted. So what? Or the embrace or clinging of greed has been avoided, or we could say abandoned, a slightly different interpretation. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. Having already dealt with various levels of what's subtle and gross, worldly power, religious power of different kinds, here by this verse he takes up a more internal consideration. Here he has dealt with 3 positive saintly attributes: absence of craving, absence of anger, avoidance or abandonment of greed. Either you never had the greed, so it was avoided, or you abandoned it if you had it. All 3 of these are be considered beneficial for spiritual beings. Certainly, once again, he's not decrying these things, but he's saying you need to perceive your own nature. If you retain the idea of being an ego entity, a samsaric being, even if you have stopped the craving, even if you have avoided the delusion of anger, even if you have abandoned any sense of greed, which is not harmful in itself, still, if you're dreaming of yourself as an embodied ego, maybe a more saintly one, in the final analysis, so what? You must proceed to know yourself. And for one who knows himself, he's cut the very root of craving, anger, greed, etc. And so is it any marvel that the manifestations of that root, the effect, are missing? So toward this, the enlightened can say, so what? Verse 15.
मोहध्वान्तपेशितो वा ततः किं जातो भूमौ निर्मदो वा ततः किं मात्सर्यार्तिर्मीलिता वा ततः किं येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत्.
Or the veil of delusion has been torn. So what? He continues to ascend in the verse. The veil of delusion has been torn. So what? Or one has become devoid of arrogance in the world. In other words, one has become humble. So what? Or the distress of jealousy has ceased to be. So what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. If we can eliminate delusion, but we still don't know the self, that is delusion over so many matters in our mind, we still don't know the self. So what? Haven't we cut ourselves short? Or if we become humble in the world, but still retain egoity, still think of ourselves as an ego entity, Shankar says, so what? You need to know the self. Jealousy has ceased to be. All right, good enough, but so what, unless you've directly perceived your own nature? And if you have directly perceived your own nature, then the disappearance of the effects of ignorance, when the cause has been uprooted entirely and found to be non-existent, in response to that, a great sage like Shankara would say, so what?
So it seems like that all these last ones are kind of eliminating attachments in the mind. In other words, greed, etc. So it seems like for the aspirant, they definitely would be in a lot better place than somebody, obviously, with those.
The emphasis at this point in the text is switched from a straightforward deprecation to pointing out the emphasis upon self-realization, how important it is. He's already dismissed everything of a worldly nature. He's already dismissed everything of an external religious nature. He's dismissed everything gross and subtle. He's dismissed everything pertaining to the siddhas, that is, the miraculous powers and miraculous beings. He's already dismissed those involved in meritorious works, etc., their approach. At this point, he's dismissing those who have the development of saintly attributes. By dismissing them, I mean to say dismissing the mental attitude that stops with that and does not include the direct perception of one's own nature. Verse 16 continues. Now he addresses, we might say, those who reach mystical heights, the visionaries, the seers.
Dhaturlokas sadhito va tatakim Vishnor loko vikshito va tatakim Shambhor lokas shasito va tatakim Yena swatmanaiva sakshat krito bhut.
Or the world of Brahma has been attained, so what? Or the world of Vishnu has been seen, so what? Or the world of Shambhu, Shiva, has been ruled, so what? By whom one's own self has not indeed been directly perceived. In the scriptures, the world of Brahma is said to be the ideal place from which to reach the final attainment of Brahman. Shankara says, unless you've directly perceived your own nature, so what? And then according to the tradition, some say to be in the same world as Vishnu, to be in the same world as Shiva, to attain that loka, that realm. That's heaven. He says, so what? Not only that, he says, not only has it been seen, but you've actually been the ruler of it. You're governing it. Attaining such a mystical height. He says, so what? If you haven't directly perceived your own nature. And if you have directly perceived your own nature, then you are abiding in that, as that, in which Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva have ceased to exist. So the realms of experience to which such pertained, you feel towards that transcendent indifference, so what? Now he sums up the point of the text.
Yasyedam hridaye samya Anatmasri-vigarhana-prakarnam Sadodeti sa evatma Sakshatkarasya bhajanam.
One for whom this clear deprecation of acquisition that is non-self always arises in the heart, alone has experience of the direct perception of the self. While reading this tonight, we've discussed each verse from, we could say, both angles of vision, from aspiration and from being established in the self. Here he makes it clear that the main emphasis or main intention of the text is to help those who are aspiring, since those who already realize the self will understand it already. So he says, this is what's important, that you have the same detachment, the same utter indifference to all else but the self. And if you do such, then you'll have that direct perception. And only one who has this detachment arising or shining in one's heart will realize the truth of the self. If this is not arisen, then that to which you remain attached will appear as an obstacle. And to say one realizes the self but still remains attached would just be a case of fooling oneself. And if that would happen, so what? You need to know yourself.
So dealing with attachments one by one, detaching from them is really not where spiritual practice is at.
If you had to go one by one, it would be better to approach that way than to remain attached. But if you know the source of happiness within yourself, then you cut at the root of all attachments. If you can discern the source of happiness, you become detached from everything. If further you can discern what is real and what is not, your detachment reaches great strength, great height. And if you know that reality, that source of happiness, as your own being, and you identify completely with it, then your detachment is absolute. Whether you address one attachment, a group of attachments, or all of them at once, the aim is to be utterly detached in the knowledge of yourself.
In the knowledge of oneself.
Make sure that goal is reached. All at once or one at a time doesn't make a difference. Final verse of the actual text.
Anye tu bhayika jagat Bhranti vyamoha mohitaha Na tesham jayate kwapi Swatma sakshat krutir bhuvi.
But others, being deluded by the delusion of the erroneous apprehension, that is to say the confusion, of the illusory world, not for them at any time arises the direct perception of one's own self in this world. So the last two verses go together. If you detach yourself, you'll realize the truth. If you don't, and you remain deluded, thinking you're in the world, and you're trying to obtain things of the world, then not any time in that illusory world will there arise the real liberation from bondage, the realization of the truth, which alone is bliss. He has chalked out the path. It is abundantly clear which way to go.
Iti Srimad Paramahamsa Parivrajaka Acharyasya Shri Govinda Bhagavat Pujya Pada Shishyasya Srimad Shankara Bhagavata Kritau Anatmasri-vigarhana-prakarnam Sampurnam.
Thus of the venerable, glorious, highest renunciate, wandering recluse, and great spiritual teacher, Sri Govinda Bhagavan, whose feet are to be worshipped, the disciple, the venerable, glorious Shankara Bhagavan, by him composed, the treatise in deprecation of acquisition, that is, non-self, concludes.
Labdha vidya rajamanya tata kim Prapta sampat prabhavadya tata kim Bhukta nari sundarangi tata kim Yena swatmanaiva sakshat krito bhut. केयूराद्यैर्भूषितो वा ततः किम् कौशेयाद्यैरावृतो वा ततः किम् तृप्तो मृष्टानादिना वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत् दृष्टानानाचारुदेशा ततः किम् पुष्टाश्चेष्टा बन्धुवर्गाः ततः किम् नष्टं दारिद्र्यादिदुःखं ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत् स्नातस्तीर्थे जनुजादौ ततः किम् दानं दत्तं द्व्यष्टसंख्यं ततः किम् जप्ता मन्त्रा कोटिशो वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत् गोत्रं सम्यग्भूषितं वा ततः किम् गात्रं भस्माच्छादितं वा ततः किम् रुद्राक्षादिसद्धृतो वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत् अन्नैर्विप्रास्तर्पिता वा ततः किम् यज्ञैर्देवास्तोषिता वा ततः किम् कीर्त्या व्याप्ता सर्वलोकाः ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत् कायक्लिष्टश्चोपवासैस्ततः किम् लब्धा पुत्रा स्वीयपत्न्यास्ततः किम् प्राणायामसाधितो वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत् युद्धे शत्रुर्निर्जितो वा ततः किम् भूयो मित्रैः पूरितो वा ततः किम् योगैः प्राप्ता सिद्धयो वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत् अब्धिपद्भ्यां लङ्घितो वा ततः किम् वायुकुम्भे स्थापितो वा ततः किम् मेरुपाणाम् उद्धृतो वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत् श्वेलपीतो दुग्धवद्वा ततः किम् वह्निर्जग्धोलाजवद्वा ततः किम् प्राप्तश्चारपक्षिवत्खे ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूत् बद्धा सम्यक् पावकाद्यास्ततः किम् साक्षात् विद्धा लोहवर्यास्ततः किम् लब्धो निक्षेपोञ्जनाद्यैस्ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो भूपेन्द्रत्वं प्राप्तमुर्व्यां ततः किम् देवेन्द्रत्वं संहृतं वा ततः किम् मुण्डीन्द्रत्वं चोपलब्धं ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो मन्त्रैः सर्वस्तम्भितो वा ततः किम् बाणैर्लक्ष्यो भेदितो वा ततः किम् कालज्ञानं चापि लब्धं ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो कामातङ्कः खण्डितो वा ततः किम् कोपावेशः कुण्ठितो वा ततः किम् लोभाश्लेषो वर्जितो वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो मोहध्वान्तपेषितो वा ततः किम् जातो भूमौ निर्मदो वा ततः किम् मात्सर्यार्तिर्मीलिता वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो धातुर्लोकः साधितो वा ततः किम् विष्णोर्लोको वीक्षितो वा ततः किम् शम्भोर्लोकः शासितो वा ततः किम् येन स्वात्मानैव साक्षात्कृतो यस्येदं हृदये सम्यक् अनात्मश्रीविगर्हणम् सदोदेति स एवात्मा साक्षात्कारस्य भाजनम् अन्ये तु मायिकजगत् भ्रान्तिव्यामोहमोहिताः न तेषां जायते क्वापि स्वात्मसाक्षात्कृतिर्भुवि स्वात्मसाक्षात्कृतिर्भुवि स्वात्मसाक्षात्कृतिर्भुवि
Shanti.